So no matter how many stupid marketers are trying to pop and convince you that everything is AI and everything's going to be taken over by AI, it's simply not the case. And if you're in the real world, you know that pretty much more than half of the entire internet, if not a much higher number, is run on WordPress. And if you're a dev, you're definitely going to be at some point where you're going to have to create a WordPress plugin, which is probably why you clicked on this video. So in this kind of short series, this is video number 1 of what is basically going to be 5 videos. And I'd like to get your feedback. Like, please, if you're watching this, look at the style. I'm still kind of figuring out like a method that works for me. So most of the videos will shortly sort of be the same because I kind of shot them all together. But then here or there might be some with a little bit of a different approach. Do check them. Let me know what you think. Let me know what you think I can improve on, or, that's just like a waste of time. It's unnecessary. And I'd like to know, would you be interested in watching these videos more if they were like live sessions, like debugging and really kind of building something? Do you like this kind of tutorial style that I'm doing with this one? Do you like the screencast versus, talking? I'd love to get your feedback, really, just so I can improve this and I can make it more enjoyable for you to watch, because ultimately I'm making this for you. I'm making this so you've got kind of access to great ideas, and it's stuff that I wish, when I had to go through all that documentation and all those things and troubleshooting those, I'm hoping some of that knowledge comes across, speeds your development up, or just helps you kind of get to a problem quickly to kind of solve it. So without any further ado, let's get into episode 1 of the series. Okay, great. We're going to start off super simple today. Essentially, getting a plugin, there's a couple of primary things that needs to be in place, or you need to understand. Number 1 is, how do we actually get that code that we wrote to be recognized by WordPress? What is the metadata around that? And I'm not going to cover everything in that. I'm just going to give you the essentials of what you need. And then what are hooks and what are filters? Because those are the things you're going to be working with the most. Essentially, hooks is anytime WordPress fires off certain or renders off certain points inside of its code, it's going to fire off these hooks. For example, when the header runs, when the footer runs, or any of those things, any kind of activity when the admin area kind of initializes. And we can fire off our functions in conjunction with that to do something at the time that happens. So great way to kind of inject some stuff or check for some behavior or call an API or set up a database or whatever. And then there are filters. So filters is whenever there's certain content or areas that's appearing on the website, such as the footer bar or any kind of area of the site that's rendering. A filter basically sends you that data, and you can grab that data inside of your filter using the add filters method. And with the add filters method, you can very easily just get the data and manipulate that data before sending it back to WordPress in order to finish the processing of it. So for example, if we're looking at a post example, we can get that actual post and we can append something to the bottom. We can look for certain words in it and take those out. We can run regular, anything you want to do from a PHP logical point of view, you can do then with a filter. So if a default naming convention you need to change, you want to add emoticons, whatever you need to do, you need to change a currency or a language structure or something like that, you can do all of that with these processes. Now let's get into some code. Okay, short and simple of it, if you want to learn to understand hooks and filters, there are essentially 2 major commands. So if we're trying to hook into any event inside of WordPress, such as when the header loads or when the footer loads or any other thing, that would be add_hook, and then the hook that we want to lift into, and then the callback function on our side. And the exact same thing is for filters. It's add_filter, then the filter we want to hook into, and then our callback function. The core difference is that our callback function is also going to receive a value, which is the data that we are trying to filter against. So for example, if we're trying to do it against the posts, that post is actually going to be passed in, and we can then take that data, add onto it, manipulate it, do whatever we want to, and then return it to WordPress in order to display it then from there on. So those are the kind of 2 major things. But before we even get there, we actually need to make sure that WordPress recognizes our plugin. And that requires us to actually have the appropriate metadata for WordPress to register it. So let's look at that first. Okay, so what I've got here is my starter kind of piece. Now this is set up in a way, so I'm basically going to be using this just as an index guide, and I'm going to create my kind of logic here. As you can see, I've already gone ahead and kind of scaffolded all of this out, so I don't have to hand code everything while you watch and we just waste time. So there are a couple of, so this is essentially the very first thing WordPress looks at, or rather, let's just say the first thing WordPress is going to look at is that you have a qualified kind of plugin name that's not going to compete with other plugins. So you really So you really want to make sure that when you are defining your plugin name, that it's unique. So maybe start off with your company, your product, and something like that in a sequence. And then what you really want to do is you want to try and make your first opening file the same name as your plugin. It's just a convention that, everyone's familiar with. So once you're inside of that plugin file, though, that's where the very first thing at the top of the file needs to be your metadata. So that metadata, there has a few required fields. For example, we do need to know what the plugin is actually going to be called, because that has to show up inside of WordPress. We also need to know what version your plugin is in. Now, that's the absolute minimum requirement of what you have to have in order to get your plugin showing up, but that's really not the complete process. It's really, pretty bad. I would even personally go ahead and for myself, I would make the description also required. And I would also make the author required because, you want bragging rights, don't you? This is your work. So I would definitely go and make that, at least for myself, personally required. And also, if you do want to make the URL that's going to be linked into that or linked to your name, do the same thing there. And you want to also have a location, and again, we will need this later, is the update URL. That's where they'll give the information for the update. So core ones, let's go over them. Firstly, the plugin and where the plugin is kind of located, or at least the website for that plugin if you're going to have one. Description, what version you're currently in for your plugin. The author name, author URL, that's your own unique URL. What the text domain is. So text domain and domain path, this is really for translation. So you'll see oftentimes that underscore before name. So if you're using translations in your files, that's where that's going to be relative. The license, again, not required, but kind of good to have in there along with reference to that license. And then these are quite useful because oftentimes these would be used by the plugin store to determine if your plugin is viable for the current version of WordPress. So it requires at least, and also with your PHP. So then there is your updated URL. So where that is, we're not really going to cover that in the series. However, if it's something you are really interested in, please let me know in the comments. And we can always look at adding another video onto the series as there's specific requests from you, and we build it out like that. Any tags that you want, these will be useful for searching. And then the network option, if this is going to be used as a multi-site plugin, also not something that we're going to be using. And if you've got any other contributors that you're working with. So that's the first kind of single most kind of starting part with your plugin before you even get anything up and running. So let's just quickly look at where that shows up if you don't know already. Okay, so this information that we have here is essentially what's going to show up if I'm in my plugins area: the plugin name, the description, the version, the author, and then the plugin website. This is all kind of useful information that you want to have on it, but obviously there is more. You can expand this out. You can include buttons and links and all kinds of things on that. So you're not limited by just that. And I think then the only other thing we've got to be aware of is there's obviously multiple ways you can add the plugin. So when you're going to upload it via the interface, that obviously needs to be as a zip file with the content that we just kind of described there inside of the root of the zip. But alternatively, while you're in dev mode, you can just manually upload that as well to your environment or set it up. As long as you're making sure you're putting it inside of the WP-contents folder /plugins, and your folder is in there within its folder name. Because that's essentially what the upload plugin is going to do. It's just going to upload that zip, unzip it to that folder location. So that's also how it's going to determine if an existing version of the plugin is there, and if it should update that or just leave it as is. Okay, but our focus again here is action. So let's get into action. So all I've got here is I've just got a path to where my plugin is, and I'm requiring that. So I'm passing in the file, so that's where I am, or the current directory of where I am. And then I'm going to go to chapters, action, and that's just the link that I've built up. So I've added a whole bunch of comments here for you, along with a whole bunch of little kind of examples and stuff. And that's just because there is a repo link to this, so you can just download this code. And that's really just because sometimes it's useful. You want to just see maybe there is a case-sensitive issue, or there's a spelling issue or something in your code, and you want to be able to compare that. So I've got you for that, so you can check that out. And again, I'm doing this now as kind of like a walkthrough. If you would rather see me live code this or anything like that, do let me know, and maybe some debugging processes and stuff as I hit them. That's also an option, but I'd love to hear from you. Okay, so we're going to look at a few things here. We're going to look at action hooks, filters. We're going to be looking at the priorities inside of those, passing parameters into them. We're also going to be looking at creating our custom hooks, as well as removing hooks that we might be in conflict with. And then last, we're also going to be looking at just adding conditions inside of those hooks when we want to fire them off only on certain pages or by certain rules. So let's get into that quickly. Okay, so firstly, when we come to hooks, like some of the available commands and queries that we've got is the @_hook. And again, this takes in a hook, a callback function, the priority in terms of a number, and any arguments that need to be passed into that. And the exact same is true for when we're adding a filter. And when we're removing a hook or a filter, then we are only going to pass in the hook that we're referencing, the callback function, and the priority and what point we want to remove that. Okay, then we have the do action and apply filters. That's usually done by the WordPress core. Essentially, it just fires off any actions or any callbacks linked to those specific filters. So maybe something hasn't fired off or any problems with that, and then you can kind of force that to fire off again. We have the has action and has filter. That's just to check, do these exist? That's very useful, especially if you're working with other plugins and you want to check if maybe a specific function inside of WooCommerce or LearnPress or something is available. We've got get current action to check what the current action is. And we also have doing action, so we can see if a current action or filter is currently in progress. Okay, so let's look at that in action quickly. Let's just say I want to fire off my function the moment the WordPress footer hooks out. And that's quite simple. I can simply pass the WP_footer in order to get access to when that fires off, that hook fires off. And then I fire off my callback function. And again, the parameters of priority and arguments, those are optional parameters. And here, all I've got is I'm then firing off. I point that out. So that callback is essentially my function name or my method's name. And then inside of this, now, for example, here, I'm already applying a conditional. I'm basically saying is _admin. So in other words, are we in the admin space here? And if we're not in the admin space, then I want to just echo out this, thanks for visiting our site. So if I go to my little snippet here, and now, for example, I just go over to loading the main web page, and I scroll all the way down, I'm going to see absolutely nothing because I have to first activate my plugin. So let's activate the plugin. And then let's refresh the page, scroll all the way down, and then see at the bottom, thank you for visiting my site or our site. Okay, cool. Okay, so the next one up is the priorities that we can also set. So in this example, we're going to fire off one in conjunction with the head. So VP_head is the hook that we're going to fire off in so we can get into the header. And here are my functions. Now, the core difference here is the parameter that I'm passing in. See, the first one I'm passing in a 5, and the second one I'm passing in a 15. And now you can see I'm pretty much passing these in as comments. So we can just put them in the HTML as comments. And if you look at this, we basically, anything in 1 to 5 is going to execute very early. In 10 will be the default priority. Hence, that if you don't pass in a variable, that's essentially what we're going to be getting. And then 15 to 20 is a later execution. So that'll execute after the main code is kind of outputted. So it'll come afterwards. And then a 99, 100, anything like that is going to be very late in the execution. So let's quickly look at an example. This is already in and up in our plugin. So if I go to my page, and again, because that is now a comment or a HTML, I'm going to go Control U in order to get to my source code. And then if I just look here, I can see on line 8, there's my very early content. And then there is my later content that fires off. So this is the default at 15. This is my default. Whereas if I'm looking for my late and I'm going over to 15, my priority 15, it's only going to be firing off here at line 242. Okay. So versus where my early content on 5 was firing off at line 12 already. So you want to be careful on how you utilize that. And it really depends on when you need to execute it. So maybe there's other scripts like a CSS or something like that you need to load up earlier. And in those cases, it would be useful to use the priority a little bit later down. Next up is passing multiple parameters into your hooks. So essentially, certain hooks or filters have parameters available to them. And it's almost like in JavaScript when you're breaking out certain parameters instead of just getting everything. So in this instance, I am passing through the number 3, and I'm exploding essentially those 3 kind of core parameters that come available. Now, these will be different depending on what you're hooking into or what you're filtering into. So you do want to check the documentation for what is available in terms of that. So in this case, I'm passing in the post ID, the post, and the update. Now I'm able to use that because now I can say based upon the post, I'm looking for the attribute post status. Is that equal to published? And then I'm making sure this is not a revision post, and I'm passing in the post ID to check if it is. And if it's not, now I can log whatever I want to do, or I can do whatever logic I want to. But essentially now I have those additional parameters available for me that I can check and work against. And again, they'll be different based upon whatever section you are working in or what kind of hook there is. So you might just want to check the WordPress codex for that. Now, there are several commonly used WordPress filters and hooks that you can connect with. For example, there are the lifecycle hooks. Now, these include hooks like init, WP load, template redirect, WP head, WP footer, and WP underscore enqueue scripts, as well as, for example, shutdown. That is essentially when the PH script finishes execution. Now, don't worry, it's not going to fire off after that, but just before that essentially stops. We also have admin hooks like admin underscore init, admin underscore menu, underscore enqueue scripts for admin, underscore notices, underscore footer, and the like. We also have hooks for the user specifically, like WP underscore login or underscore logout, user underscore register, profile underscore update, and delete underscore user, to name a few. We also then got hooks related to the theme, such as after underscore setup underscore theme, switch underscore theme, and widget underscore init as a couple of examples. We also have your Ajax hooks. So you see a lot of those with a lot of front-end kind of tools, and those would fall into two predominant categories. So WP underscore Ajax underscore the action, because these are custom defined, the action that you want to fire off. And then there's another one, which is WP underscore Ajax underscore no priv, as a no privilege, underscore your action. The core difference between the two of these is that the one is for authenticated users and the second is for inauthenticated users. We have other ones, for example, like crons, for example, the ability to delete the cron with WP underscore scheduled underscore delete, as well as auto cleaning up drafts, as well as kind of our own custom hooks that we can also place in terms of that. Now, when it comes to filters, we're automatically going to get the content related to the filter that we can pass in. We can also break that up into parts, but let's look at very quickly how we can, for example, modify some content on the post area. So first we get, for example, the underscore content filter. Now this is content that's going to be available in all areas, such as post, single pages, all kinds of things like that, because it's the content hook. So when we're doing that, we really want to make sure that we are filtering or adding some conditions to make sure we're getting it for the area that we want. So we're just not firing it off everywhere. So in this case, I'm passing it to my function, my callback function, and obviously I'm getting its content available filter. And from here on, I'm starting to add in some conditionals. Now, the conditionals here are very simple. I'm saying is single. In other words, it's not like an archive page, like where I see all my posts. I'm using the is single. In other words, I'm not looking for if it is a page or an archive. I'm basically just saying, is this a single post that I'm on? And then I'm going to say, in the loop. In other words, I want this firing off inside of the loop of the information being output? And is this part of the main query? So which is the query that'll basically be filtering for the post. So all I'm doing then is I'm not overriding my data. I'm just appending, as you can see, another little div block in terms of that. And then and this is the important thing, you always want to return that data. Otherwise, WordPress is not going to be able to render the content that actually is supposed to be there. So in this case, if I now go over to my blog, I'm going to see absolutely nothing because I don't have any blog posts, but I can go ahead and I can go add a blog post, say, hello world, some funky content. I'm going to publish that, and let's go view our post. And now we've got our additional thank you for reading, share your thoughts in your comments, which is what we're outputting here inside of our other piece. Now, and obviously now I've passed in my CSS, so I can modify that perhaps by using WP enqueue scripts to load up some scripts, depending on obviously the control I have on the plugin that I'm doing. For example, if you just got to override a function file and you don't have all the power, maybe you're going to do that way. Otherwise, if it's your own plugin, you can do a lot more. Now, again, the same, I can have ones where I break up the parameters, in which case I'm just passing in title and post. I'm doing the exact same thing as I was doing there. I'm looking at that, and I'm adding this little emoticon into it. So hence why when I actually look at my hello world, I've got my little emoticon that's popped in there because I've just taken the title and I've just prepended to the title that little emoticon. Something else I can do is on those filters, there's also the actual queries that are running on those pages. So let's just say I want to limit the amount of queries, maybe for posts or anything like that. I can always do that by just overriding the query. So in this case, I'm getting the pre_get_post. In other words, before the posts are firing, passing that over and passing the query in. And now I can make sure that firstly, I'm not in the admin. This is the main query for that section. And then I want to maybe add some conditions. Firstly, am I on the home page? And if I'm on the home page, make sure that I set that query, specifically the posts per page parameter on that query to be limited to 5. And then maybe I have my uncategorized section. And I want to make sure that none of those posts show up. So I can also say from the query, get the is category. And then if it is set, if the category is set, then I want to remove maybe number 1 from that cat query that's inside of the query. So I can add that in. Now, again, just like with hooks or filters, you also have a range of options to choose from, such as the content filters we just talked about. And that could be the_content, the_title, the_expert, the_excerpt, the W_title for the title tag, the get_the_excerpt, the WP_trim_excerpt, excerpt_length, and excerpt_more, such as when you want to change that read more link to, for example, say something else like checkout post or whatever. We also have template folders such as body_class, which adds a tag to the body class, post_class, which allows us to add classes to the post container, single_template, which allows us to modify the single post template, page_template, which allows us to modify page templates, archive_template, obviously for the archive, search_template to modify the search, 404_template, which allows us to do modifications on the 404 page. We also have the navigation filter, such as nav_menu_css_class, WP_nav_items. This allows us to modify the menu items. WP_page_menu allows us obviously to modify the menu. WP_list_page, which allows us to modify a page listing. Then we got the queries that run on those pages. For example, the one you just saw, pre_get_post, which allows us to modify the main query underneath the post before it executes. With that, we also have post_per page. We have query_var for when we want to add additional query variables to that. And then we have requests in case we want to actually modify the entire request being passed out. When it comes to user authentication, we have things like authenticate, WP_login_errors, so we can modify those pesky error messages. Login_redirect in case we want to change that. Logout_redirect, obviously, for when their user is logging out. User_contact method, so if we want to change the contact method. Get_avatar if we want to override, for example, the standard gravatar avatars that show up. Admin filters, admin_footer, update footer, plugin_action, and the list goes on. Email filters, we can modify the email, we can modify the from name, we can modify the content type. Sanitize file names, which is very useful when we come to the security filters. W_die handlers, how do we modify those error messages? Map_meta_cap, so how do we modify, these are modifiers for capability mapping. Editable roles, we can modify those. Widget filters, so we have widget_title. We can modify dynamics_sidebar params that we can pass in or manipulate. So widget display callback, we can also manipulate those. And then we have the ever popular, I'm kidding, internationalization filters. So those are the language ones, the locale, the get text with context. So if ever we want to change those. Quick outfit change. So naturally, there may be a couple of things that are coming in from other plugins or WordPress itself that you don't necessarily want inside of your application. Perhaps for performance, or maybe it's contradicting something else that you're doing, and you just want to remove that overhead. You can simply use the remove_action or the remove_filter in order to target that specific item. Now, what we're going to do is we're going to be targeting, obviously, the hook. But what we're trying to do is we're trying to remove a specific function off of that hook that's usually fired off when the do_hooks runs. So, for example, in WordPress itself, there is the WordPress generator hook, which gives us the version of the WordPress. Now, that's something you might want to remove because you don't want hackers to identify what version of WordPress you're on just by scraping your HTML. We can do that by doing the remove_action on the WP_head hook, and then we can pass in the function that we're trying to remove from that. So in this case, the W_generator. Others that you also might want to remove that's not always that common use is something like the RSD, the really simple discovery, the live writer manifest for Windows. You could also affect the formatting that it maybe injects inside of the excerpts. And you can also, if you wanted to, affect the capital data that just capitalizes the P on side of the WordPress when it's found inside of the text. And that's just another filter that's there. Now, in this case, I'm just firing this off in terms of my init. So the moment that my WordPress initializes, I'm going to fire off my remove hooks function to go ahead and just remove all of those out. That way I'm firing it off before they all kind of get their opportunity to dance around. Now, naturally, just like other plugins such as WooCommerce or Elementor or many of the others, you may have custom solutions that you want to make available also as hooks that's going to fire off in conjunction with other of your activity, such as with WooCommerce's the product page or any of the others. The way you would do that is naturally inside of your plugin, you're going to have a variety of different functions that handles a couple of different solutions. For example, listing product pages or doing anything like those. Now, maybe you have a name structure that comes back and you want to give the user the ability to filter that. Or maybe you want to give them a before and after hook on top of an existing function that they can fire off some of their own logic, such as modifying the HTML or anything like that. So let's assume we've got a function inside of our code called display custom content. That'll be now, in this case, our custom hooks. So inside of that, what we want to do in order to fire off the hooks that the user's now created, aligning to our hook. So in other words, their add_action, which will then pass in the hook that we've created, and obviously their function to filter against that. The way our code reads that up is by using the do act, very similar to how WordPress would fire off its hooks. So it's the do actions will then basically give the name of the hook that we're letting fire off in that sense. So we can simply define it inside of this area. So here you can see an example where I'm doing the do action and I'm defining a hook for it that I'm going to fire off. And then I've got another one at the bottom, which I'm doing after the content. And this is inside of my function that I'm outputting. So then as the user, or even as myself, if I want to manipulate or reuse that component, I can then just do a normal standard add_action, pass in the hook that I've now defined, and obviously the callback method that's going to be used for it in the classic and typical way. So it's that simple. The same thing is really the case when I want to do filters. So in this case, I have a function called getGreetingMessage, and I'm passing in a parameter, or I'm expecting a parameter there of name. And then what I'm going to be doing is I'm going to echo whatever that name is going to be. Maybe that's just how I'm greeting. And obviously, if you do your own logic, maybe you're outputting the user's name or something like that. And what I want to do is I want the ability to filter this message. So I'm allowing the user to pass in some modifying data. And the same as the do actions, to fire off the filters, I'm going to be using apply_filters. And apply_filters, here I've got my name that I'm giving it. And then the same thing is when the user wants to pass that in, they're going to add _filters in the traditional way that they would normally add a filter or pass a filter in. They're giving it the name, they're giving their callback function, and they're giving the value of 10. Now I'm passing in 2 because I'm ultimately making 2 parameters available for my user to modify. That is the content and the modifying data. So the content is the data that I'm actually going to be returning, and then the data I'm allowing them to manipulate. So in this case, I'm just giving the ability. In this case, I'm just overriding that entire message based upon whatever the message is. So at first it'll say hello, keeping whatever the default name is, and then just welcome to our site, which is what I'm going to append onto that. So the take the message, and the apply filter is simply going to take the message that already is there and append onto it and prepend to it a little bit of more details. So very quick and simple. You can easily expand your plugins by making it more user-friendly for other developers if they want to play and work with your conditions. Now, speaking of conditions, WordPress is full of a variety of different areas. You obviously don't want your hooks and your filters affecting absolutely everything, because a lot of those may be in use for other reasons. And also, it's a lot of overhead on the site that's also going to affect performance. And you always need to consider the performance of your site. So WordPress gives us a lot of conditional hooks. We've already looked at a few of those. Let's look at a few more. So some of the ones you're going to use very commonly is the is_single. That'll be, for example, single parse. And we've already looked at that. We've got the is_home to see if we're on the home page, is_admin if we're on the admin page, is_singular. That would be when we're looking at a very specific post type, such as book, which we're going to create in the series, is_archive. That would be the archive. In other words, the listing of the posts page, is_category. So if we're putting those posts inside of category pages. We also then have is underscore tag, is author, is search, is for a form, is page when it's just an actual page and not a post, is attachment if you want to look for attachments. And then you can also see things like is user logged in, which is especially useful obviously if you want to load up different functionality or views depending on the user's authentication. And speaking of user authentication, that leads us into current user can. So current user can only give us the access or the rights to the privilege of the current user, but we can get the actual current user with WP underscore get current user. Now that gives us a role key inside of it. So we can very easily pass or generate an array with a couple of different roles, and then we can use that to intersect. So we can double check there for different role authentications. But it's also another solution that you can use based upon what you want to render, depending on user roles or any other activity that's available on the user object if you want to get it back that way. Now, just another one, you can also use closures with your hooks. In other words, you don't have to use a callback or define it to a callback. If it's a very small function, you can very easily just handle that in line. So in this one where I have add action score and I'm trying to target the WP underscore footer, then I can just pass in a normal function and then inside do whatever I need to do. So that's very good if you just need to do very simple tasks very quickly. Although it might not be the best recommendation, but if you're testing things, that's quite a useful way to go about it. Lastly, something you might want to consider is proper good object-oriented programming when you're utilizing your development. So you can also bind all of these specific groups maybe into specific classes that handle specific areas, and then you can simply fire off those classes. Now, one way of doing that is naturally in the construct function. So if I'm defining a normal kind of class, and I'm kind of containing inside of all of my elements, and all your typical object-oriented rules will obviously apply to that. Or in your construct method, you can then very easily just fire off those add actions that you want to in order to sequentially fire off those specific callbacks that you've then defined inside of that. Okay, so that pretty much covers it in the area of hooks and filters and getting you started in terms of those. Just a couple of things you always want to keep in mind is number one, keep good prefixes towards what you're doing. It's very easy for someone to have a similar name idea than you want. So really consider your name spacing prefixes so they're specific to you and your organization. And make sure that carries over down to the function level as well, not just the name of your plugin, but everything that you're going to be doing, because again, similar names, similar places. Make sure your names and your titles for your hooks as well as for your callbacks are descriptive. They kind of clarify what they do, so it's easy for someone to read, and also so that your code is fairly well organized. So do take advantage of using classes and executing them appropriately. It's just going to make life a lot easier for other people looking at your plugin in the future or working with you. And you're going to thank yourself later when you're going to come back to it after a year of working on something else, or a few months, or every time you're going to come back to update it. So also make sure you add some documentation, maybe a README and some Markdown, as well as some good code comments along the way. It'll make your life easier. It might be a bit more work up front, but you're going to thank yourself later on. Remember to use hook priority depending on what's happening. You might be trying to get a function going and it's just not happening. And that may just be that another method was running after yours and overriding what you've done, or maybe running earlier and removing a hook that you're depending on. So because of that, not only you should consider the utilization of priorities, but you should also consider using proper error logging so you can log and debug as you go while you're debugging your environment, because you don't know necessarily. Something may work perfectly in your environment, your test spaces, and then you share it with a client or you share it out in the public, and then it fails in other environments because you haven't tested against those themes, you haven't tested against those other plugins that again may affect the filter and hook system in some other way. So writing things to logs in a way that you can get those logs is going to be a lifesaver. And then just, look at the security again. Make sure you're sanitizing any input data. You're validating user activities against the permission or the roles of that user. And you're using your conditions appropriately so you're not firing it off in all the wrong spaces. So the last thing I'm going to leave you with on this one before we head out back to the desk is there's a couple of useful little debugging tools that you might want to use, which is the has action. So we can see if that action actually is available or still available. It may be dropped between versions. We also have get current action and current filter. so we can find out what the current action and current filter is that we're firing in. And then we have a benefit of something called a doing underscore action. So doing underscore action can be used to print out what action's happening and what time. So if you need to figure out what's firing off when, you can use doing underscore action against a certain to figure out exactly what's going on inside of it. And at any point, if you are uncertain of what is available in that version, you can do you can pass in the global WP underscore filter. And then from that, you can var dump any items inside of it in order to pick what's actually firing off against that, such as the init function or the WP or any of the other hooks, which are then going to be available to you and show you what else is picking up. This way you can write conditional logic against those to prevent or notify the user of a conflicting plugin or function or something that may have an impact against your development. I hope you learned something, and I'll see you in the next lesson. Okay, I hope that was useful. You learned something. Again, if you can kind of share suggestions on how I can kind of get better at this, I'd love to hear it, because these are my first longer tutorials. And I want to keep pumping up some cool stuff. So if you also got other subjects or topics you want to hear about, let me know. And also check a link down below. So links for the series, if they're available at the time of you watching this video, so you can get the whole collection of them.